So welcome everyone. I hope everybody enjoyed your morning exercise up and down the stairs. Was not planned. I'm Ariel Anbar. I'm the president of the Biogeosciences section of the AGU, which has the honor of organizing the Sagan Lecture this year. The Sagan Lecture is shared between Biogeosciences and Planetary Sciences sections. On even-numbered years, Biogeosciences hosts it. On odd-numbered years, Planetary Science hosts it. And so on behalf of both sections and the leadership of both sections, I want to welcome you here. The Sagan Lecture has mostly focused on other worlds, reflecting Carl Sagan's identity as a planetary scientist and astrobiologist. But Carl Sagan was as passionate about the future of life on this world as he was about the search for life on others. And he saw these as related questions. And that's nowhere better expressed than in his book, Pale Blue Dot, A Vision of the Human Future in Space. He was inspired by the image of Earth taken by the Voyager 1 spacecraft as it passed the orbit of Saturn. And here's what he wrote. The Earth is the only world known so far to harbor life. There is nowhere else, at least in the near future, to which our species could migrate. Visit, yes. Settle, not yet. Like it or not, for the moment, the Earth is where we make our stand. It has been said that astronomy is a humbling and character-building experience, and there is perhaps no better demonstration of the folly of human conceits than this distant image of our tiny world. To me, it underscores our responsibility to deal more kindly with one another and to preserve and cherish the pale blue dot, the only home we've ever known. And it's in that spirit that I'm thrilled to introduce Ken Caldera from the Carnegie Institute of Science to give the 2018 Carl Sagan Lecture. Many astrobiologists know Ken for a highly influential paper that he wrote with Jim Casting back in Nature in 1992, titled The Lifespan of the Biosphere Revisited. And in that paper, Ken and Jim Casting predicted that we have about 1 billion years to go before Earth can no longer support a plant-based biosphere. Since that time, Ken has focused his attention on the less distant future. He's become a pioneer in studying the environmental consequences of climate change and how we might avoid them. Notably, he was one of the first to point out the challenge of ocean acidification. More recently, he's grappled with how humans might respond to the climate challenge, delving into energy transitions and even climate engineering. Throughout, Ken has been an inspiration for his combination of creativity and clear thinking, and his willingness to focus on key challenges. For this, he became an AGU Fellow in 2010, but he also became one of the more influential science voices reaching across and beyond the traditional science community. And maybe there's no better example of that than a blog post in 2016 by Bill Gates, who, as some of you know, reads widely, talks to people widely, and blogs prolifically. Gates wrote a blog post in which he described Ken as, quote, my amazing teacher on matters of climate and energy. And so today we have the good fortune to welcome and honor Ken as our amazing teacher. So with that, Ken Caldera.
Hi, so first I'd like to thank Ariel and the Biogeosciences group and the astrobiology for inviting me to do this lecture, and it's certainly an honor. And also, I'm not like there's no image in this talk that's in any of my other talks, so I sort of rapidly tried to throw something together for this. I also was panicking. I've been thinking about this talk ever since Ariel asked me to do it, having no idea what in the world I was going to talk about. I even expressed my panic on Twitter and got some suggestions. So anyway, here we go. So I can't see the screen from here. I guess I can see this. But just as I was sort of Googling around looking for things to talk about, I found a 1954, so I guess he was 18 years old, reading list from Carl Sagan, and below this there was his course readings, but this was for a single quarter of the year, and I noticed he's 18 years old and he's reading The Immoralist by Gide, he's reading Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, a couple of books of Plato, and I think, first of all, this reminds me a little bit, not that I don't want to compare myself to Carl Sagan, but it reminds me a little bit of my reading when I was in high school, and and I think it just sort of goes to the depth of interest, and that it's not just about science, but there's some kind of merging of the science and humanities to be a full human being. I mean, scientifically, he's known for a number of things, and I'm sure David Grinspoon and others could expand on this more, but I guess one of it was the synthesis of amino acids abiotically. But he had a long career at Cornell as a scientist, and obviously, like all of us, has a personal life in addition to a scientific life. The first, my first connection, kind of the first I really, Carl Sagan penetrated my mind, was really this book here, called Dragons of Eden. And in this book, I'm just remembering, now it's 40 years ago or so that this book was published, and so my memory of it's 40 years old. I didn't go back and reread it, but what I remember from this book was he was writing about how we kind of have this lizard brain that's our basic emotional structure of fear and desires and hunger and so on, and then over this kind of lizard brain we have this neocortex that's kind of like our superego or our decision, kind of more rational decision-making overlay on this, and that this, maybe it's also going back to almost like a Freudian id and superego, but putting it in evolutionary terms, that we have this basal brain and this overlay. And to me, this was really remarkable. And I don't have any first-hand evidence, but I've been told that he was able to write these books essentially dictating paragraph after well-formed paragraph, and then getting back the notes of what he dictated and just making minor corrections on that. And I don't know if that story is true, but even if it's partially true, I think there's an obvious a mind that's able to think coherently about a wide diversity of issues. And so this kind of mind that's willing to think about astrobiology and so on, but also write books about evolution of consciousness is really amazing. And if I was testing out some ideas in my department for this talk, and I have some speculations about evolution of consciousness, but we'll see if we get to it. My department mates strongly suggested I not talk about it. So, then I guess after reading that, the next thing was really Cosmos, and this, as it was more or less around 1980, and this, galvanized not only me, but stimulated the entire country to be thrilled about space travel and space exploration. And this was at a really important time, because through the 60s there was all of this, hullabaloo around landing on the moon, and then there was kind of a lull in interest in space travel. And really Carl Sagan almost single-handedly generated enthusiasm among broad swatches of the population in space exploration, and in general the broader, the kind of curiosity and quest for knowledge. I remember also at that time there was two quotes that stuck with me from Carl Sagan, that I didn't even realize that he was the one that said these quotes, but I've said these things to other people not knowing who said them originally. And one of this one is like, because I'm always feeling like, I have a gut feeling of what's right or wrong. And then, there's this famous quote from Carl Sagan, but I try not to think with my gut. If I'm serious about understanding the world, thinking with anything besides my brain, as tempting as that might be, it's likely to get me into trouble. And I think this is certainly true, and it would probably be good if some of our political leaders would adopt this kind of thought process. So the other quote that I didn't realize was attributed to Carl Sagan was this quote of extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which is something I frequently, in fact, I said this without knowing it was a Carl Sagan quote in a review I did recently. And of course, no brilliant comment like this, springs, people have, anytime you say anything, other people have said something similar early. So there are other sort of earlier claims to this type of quote. And I think, one early claim is Laplace, in a less pithy kind of way, basically said that similar thing. So But one thing important, as Ariel alluded to, that Carl Sagan wasn't only interested in astronomy and astrobiology, but also how well people were living here on Earth. And, and he was a believer in the power of curiosity, the power of knowledge, and the power of science. And, so there's this quote here: "Science is the golden road out of poverty and backwardness for emerging nations. The corollary, one that the United States sometimes fails to grasp, is that abandoning science is the road back into poverty and backwardness." And, I think this kind of statement has perhaps greater resonance today than it did when it was first uttered. But, but this confidence that it was really through science and technology and understanding that we were going to solve our problems is an important message for today. Just more along this line here, that again, it seems to resonate more with our current political leadership than it did back when Carl was around, but that, that widespread intellectual and moral docility may be convenient for leaders in the short term, but is suicidal for nations in the long term. One of the criteria for national leadership should therefore be a talent for understanding, encouraging, and making constructive use of vigorous criticism. Certainly, our current political leadership is far from this. So, the other thing, and I've seen this unfortunately too many times, and one sees it increasingly as one grows older, that we are intellectual and social organisms, but we're also biological organisms. And eventually our biological functioning, our homeostatic systems fail, and for Carl Sagan it was a failure to make red blood cells, and that led him to a premature death. And I hadn't recalled that he had died at such a young age, and I know when I was a graduate student, 62 didn't seem like such a young age, but now that I'm here, 62 seems way, 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 way too early, and it's just a kind of tragedy, and one wonders what he would have done if he had lived another 30 years or so. So anyway, with that, I'm going to step out of this sort of Carl Sagan review section and go into a sort of more, just more question-asking kind of discussion here. And the first thing I'm going to do is, it was just kind of a preamble. I went on Twitter and just said, "Oh, I'm panicking. What should I talk about?" And one of the postdocs in my group actually responded back, and she said, "Oh, it doesn't really fit in my talk, but I thought it would be just worth throwing out to ponder." Is that that she's pointing out, okay, we're spending all this effort to search for life on other planets, and meanwhile we're destroying all these ecosystems here on Earth, and do we have any kind of reflections on this kind of paradox? And I guess I'm just going to throw it out here because I don't really know how to deal with this exactly, other than to say that that these two quests are not zero sum, and that that appreciating life here on Earth is not inconsistent with searching for life on other planets, and that that we need to embrace both of these objectives, or certainly we need to embrace the objective of not destroying things here on Earth, and at least think about our broader context. But anyway, I just thought this was worth taking note of. But the basic sort of theme of what I wanted to talk about, and I'm not going to answer this question, is that can organisms be wildly successful at planetary scale without destroying the conditions that allow them to succeed? And this, for astrobiology, has this question of, what's the probability of finding advanced life on other planets? Is advanced life necessarily short-lived because they develop these technologies and produce wastes that ultimately make that class of organisms unable to persist on the planet? And so, maybe advanced technological societies are very ephemeral, and that it's not possible to really have them sustain for a long amount of time, but maybe it is possible to make it sustain. So anyway, we'll come back to this question, but this, I just want you to have this in your mind as the kind of framing question that I think is important for astrobiology, but obviously for all of us living on the planet, this is a central question. So when I was fortunate enough to go to New York University, which for a PhD, which maybe is not one of the premier places, but at the time Tyler Volk was there, who's in the audience, I know, and Marty Hoffert was running the department, and Brian O'Neill was there, and Francesco Tubiello, and a few other people who are in the audience today. And the first thing I did when I got there was a thing called Ecosphere, and it was a glass ball with some water in it, and it had brine shrimp in it, some algae and bacteria, and the idea was you would put it in your window, and it would be a materially closed system, but open to energy. And the idea was that, for a long time, it would cycle all the materials 100% and just be energetically open, and you'd have a closed ecosystem. And I think Tyler at the same time was working on closed ecosystems for missions to Mars and things like that. And so the question is, well, the Earth as a planet, obviously there's some cometary material and other things coming into the planet, but more or less at a planetary scale, that ecosphere is a metaphor for the planet. But in another way of looking at it, if we want to have an advanced industrial society that doesn't sort of accumulate wastes in the environment, we might need to think about, can we make our industrial ecology more like ecosphere? And the first thing I did, so there was a paper on this ecosphere in a journal called Ecological Modeling, and as a sort of master's student, I coded that up, and then tried to put an evolutionary overlay into that. So now what if we had different plankton and different bacteria competing with each other? How would evolution work in such a thing? And that ended up being a paper I did in Nature on evolutionary pressures of dimethyl sulfide emission. Anyway, I'm forgetting what exactly the thing was there, but I guess part of the idea was, can we operate our modern industrial society closer to this kind of materially closed system, energetically open? So one of my big influences through this was Marty Hoffert, and I remember, at that time, this was now the 1980s, that that Berner et al. Had come out with the BLAG model, and Walker Hayes and Casting had come out with the WAC model, and this was this idea of silicate rock weathering, monitoring, controlling atmospheric CO2 concentrations. And my understanding is that this hypothesis came out from Jim Casting was doing a model of, of oxygen on the early Earth, and he had to assume some kind of temperature background conditions, and so he kind of came up with this, well, maybe this Urey's reactions would control the temperature, and then he ended up being last. I guess Jim Walker led that study, and Jim Casting ended up being last author. But anyway, so this gave some idea, well, that there was some consistency to how planets operate and regulate their temperature. And I remember back at NYU in the 80s, we were thinking like, if we could only make a model that you'd say what's the composition of the star, and then what are the composition of the planets, and would you have plate tectonics, and the idea of having one unified model that could give you Mars, Earth, or Venus. And also around that time, there was whole questions about the greenhouse effect and how strong would it be and when would we see it. And again, the strongest evidence in support of the global greenhouse effect was really that you couldn't understand the climates of Mars and Venus without looking at the role of CO2 in the climate system. And I remember these 1D models of Martian CO2 concentrations with the CO2 going out at the poles and that sort of thing. But I think that was the beginning of looking at Earth science there for me as a subset of planetary science. Yeah, and the other thing that Marty said that I think is really right, that is controversial among economists, is that different fields like to see themselves as the primary science, and every other field is as derivative from them. And obviously the physicists have a good claim for being the fundamental science. But economists like to think of everything as it's really all economics and everything's a subset of economics. And Marty Hoffert always used to say, well, economics is the study of the allocation of scarce resources around, by one species on the third planet, orbiting some minor star, in some galaxy that's basically ignorable. And this view that, well, really, economics is an important science, but it's really a branch of behavioral biology, and we need to sort of take their mathematics, ingrained. So then my next, sorry for making this a little autobiographical, but then I went to Penn State, and this is really where I got more connected up with astrobiology, because I had an opportunity to work with Jim Casting. And Jim was super great, and one of the greatest people I've ever had the pleasure to work with, because Jim was somebody who would get more excited about my ideas than I would. And there's really nothing better in a collaborator than to have somebody tell you your ideas are good, because most people are telling you your ideas are boring and not worth working on, whereas Jim would be like, oh, that's great. And so we did things like we did one paper on the early Earth being susceptible to CO2 clouds. So, was there a metastable state to early Earth? And then we extended Jim Lovelock's work on the lifespan of the biosphere, and Ariel alluded to this. And also Jim brought me to a conference at NASA Ames where I got to meet Carl Sagan. That was my one and only meeting with Carl Sagan. And I remember at the time, I know this is maybe not a flattering thing, that he seemed to me a lot more like Mr. Rogers than I had anticipated. I don't know if that's, who knows what to make of that one. But, but Jim, one of the things that Jim imposed on me, he was in a geology department. And he said, look, this Earth's a planet, and basically Earth science is a branch of planetary science, which is a branch of astronomy, and so this geoscience department is sort of this is an astronomy department. It's an astronomy department that's focused on a narrow sort of subset of the universe, and I think this perspective of that Earth science is a branch of planetary science, and that we're really, it's about how does this planet function as a planet that's, in some vast universe, and that perspective is very different than, people who start at very small spatial and temporal scales. So, in the 1980s, Jim Lovelock wrote this book about Gaia, about the Earth being this sort of homeostatic, self-controlling system. And here's a quote by Carl Sagan that's in the same direction. He says, "What a marvelous cooperative arrangement, plants and animals each inhaling each other's exhalations, a kind of planet-wide mutual mouth-to-stoma resuscitation, the entire elegant cycle powered by a star 150 kilometers away." And this really, idea is really kind of where I started in graduate school, because we were heavily influenced by this kind of Gaia idea. Really, it didn't make much sense to me, because I don't think plants and animals are cooperating. The plant that gets eaten by an animal was, I don't think that was a cooperative relationship. And I remember there was, I guess there was I wrote a paper that was in some Gaia volume. There was a meeting, I think, in San Diego. And I think the way I looked at the Gaia thing was, well, really, if you have a system that's dominated by positive feedbacks, it's necessarily an unstable system, and the system just blows up and converts. And so stable systems, by the very nature that they're stable systems, are stable because they're dominated by negative feedbacks. And so if you, let's just even say you had like a random thing, and you had gains on different amplifiers and put a bunch of different amplifiers and made, a million different systems. Well, you'd find that the population of the persistent ones are the ones that were dominated by negative things. And then just because biology is so big on the planet, that some of these systems are going to have biological mechanisms, so it just makes sense that this planet's going to be dominated by negative feedback systems, and that many of those will incorporate biology, and it has nothing to do with teleology or goal-directedness. And I think one of the main examples of this is the rise of atmospheric oxygen a couple of billion years ago, right? So we had anaerobes on this planet. They produced oxygen as a waste product, and eventually the surface of the Earth oxidized, and oxygen accumulated. I guess maybe the upper mantle oxidized too. The oxygen started accumulating in the atmosphere, and the conditions were created that made those organisms not able to live in the environment that had generated their, had facilitated their evolution. And so, one of the questions is this going to be our fate also, or is that the way it is for creatures on planets, that if they're wildly successful, they have waste products. Eventually those waste products accumulate in the atmosphere or in the environment, and then create conditions that don't allow those organisms to persist anymore. And so I think as a reasonable first assumption is that this is the way planets with life work, that they produce wastes and eventually produce conditions that are not conducive to their survival. Now, we should point out that, of course, you can say, well, really these anaerobes were highly successful because they've created, all of us are carrying around a bunch of anaerobes in our guts and in the soils. And so, but is this going to be our fate also, that we're going to sort of just, we're going to be in some kind of future dome because we've destroyed the atmosphere and the waters, and now we produce some special environments that we live in. So, and anyway, let's babble on here. So, okay. Yeah, so again, back to this question, can a civilization be materially closed and energetically open and persist indefinitely? And I think the answer has to be no, because there's no perfect recycling of materials. I think there will always need to be material input and material output. But that indefinitely is, that's a rather strong word. And so then the question is, can we do it sort of, say, on the billion-year time scale? And I think the answer is, if we're smart, we could do it on the billion-year time scale. It's not going to be perfectly closed, but it can't last forever, but it can last long enough. And in this universe, where looking 10 years ahead is looking long distance, that worrying about billion-year time scales is maybe not something yet in the political system. But I think this idea of, we can't last indefinitely, but we could last, my guess, sort of on astronomical timescales. Yeah, and one of the challenges for doing this is, can evolution create organisms that can deal with fitness effects that will not I should have proofread this a little more, but the idea is that will only manifest, that will manifest only in future generations. In other words, since evolution works on the organism level, does that organism get to reproduce and produce viable offspring? That, we're in a situation now where if we all are just local optimizers, that's not going to work. And so this transition towards some kind of long-term sustainability depends on organisms not worrying about their narrow fitness so much as the fitness of the group. And this is kind of where I get back to the evolutionary theory. I'm going to do the consciousness trophic levels argument. That if you think of why don't when the cow wants to eat a grass, why doesn't that blade of grass run away from the cow? And the answer is energetics, that there's just too low an energy density to sunlight and too low conversion efficiency of photosynthesis for plants to have a high energy lifestyle. So they need to have a low energy lifestyle and not be very motile. This is just conjecture, right? And so then you have, then something that, before I went to graduate school, I did a neural model of a sea slug, a plesia. And you could see from the wiring of the nervous system of a sea slug that it basically has sensors on both sides. If it's sensing more light to the right, the neurons go to the muscles on the left side of its body, and it moves a little faster on the left and turns towards the light. And you can basically understand its basic behavior patterns just from the wiring diagram of its nervous system. But if you start getting to higher trophic levels, and now I'm say a pack of lions or cats or something, or dogs who are trying to chase down a highly motile animal. Now you have to think, okay, what's that animal going to do? What am I going to do in response to what it does? How are my other people in my other organisms in my social group going to respond to that? And so you start needing to model this system as I have a mental model of the world. I'm representing myself as an actor in that world. I'm representing other creatures as actors that are making decisions, and I'm trying to think of what ifs and counterfactuals. And so I think it's through this process of representing world as model and self as actor and model and others as other minds as actors and models that we sort of get to consciousness. And I forget how that fits with this question now, but we'll come back to this. So, but this thing is that I think now, I don't think evolution is really guide. Oh yeah, so this is where I was going to go. So bees, are the opposite end. Now bees are just eating things that are pretty stable in location, right? The pollen's not running away from them. And so the bees don't have to have this mental modeling of what other agents are going to do. And so bees have evolved in a way that, they really do have this sort of group, obviously genetically there's reasons of why they have this sort of group thing. And so the question is, can we use our brains to have more of this kind of group optimization and not that short time, local, and space and time optimization. So yeah, so this is the other things. Depending on how the time was going, I was going to go into a bunch of little side things, but I think I won't go too long into these ones. So I kind of did consciousness and trophic levels, which people wanted me not to do. But I do think that the basic point there, I think, is that to evolve consciousness on a planet, I think you have to get to a point where there's several trophic levels, because it's really high energy organisms that are pursuing other high energy organisms that need to represent mental models of the situation with representing self as actor, and I think that's where consciousness comes from. I've been doing a bunch of work with Mike Rampino over the years, and I never know what to think about this, but looking at life on Earth, and Mike is convinced, and he's convinced me, even though I don't really like it, that if you look at the mass extinctions on Earth, and also even the secondary ones, and then you look at the statistics of impacts and things like flood basalts, and that all these things do seem related, and one's always wondering like how much of this is coming out of cherry picking data sets, and so usually when I'm working with Mike on these ones, and we've probably done like at least a half dozen papers on these kind of correlations over the years, and Mike is usually coming up with the numbers, and I'm doing the statistics, and I'm always a little skeptical of the whole thing, but it's the same kind of numbers keep popping out of different data sets, and it does seem that at least there's some kind of extraterrestrial pacemaker to some punctuated events in Earth history, and that that mass extinction events that with extraterrestrial causation, or at least where the extraterrestrial component is a substantial factor, does seem to be a characteristic of life on this planet and likely on other planets. And so one of the things that have come up in this context, that we were doing some work in the Great Barrier Reef, looking at the effects of ocean acidification on coral reefs, and Elizabeth Colbert came out and visited us, and we ended up as a chapter in her Pulitzer Prize-winning book, and where she called the Sixth Extinction. And so, I think one of the questions is, are we right now, facing anything that's at the scale of the 5 previous extinctions? And I actually, despite liking Elizabeth and liking her book and all that, I actually don't think what we're doing now, I don't think we're anywhere near the end Cretaceous extinction event. I think what we're seeing a terrible loss of biodiversity, but it's a lot of it's the bigger, more charismatic stuff, and stuff with economic value or stuff that's not widespread. And while I think it's tragic, I don't think it's at the same scale of anywhere close to the end Cretaceous extinction, what we're going to see in the next years. Yeah, I think, you guys are probably much more, you people are much more familiar with this, but I think one of the things that's really been interesting recently, like back when I was working with Jim Casting, always the focus was on this habitable zone and how did the silicate weather feedbacks affect the habitable zones. And people didn't think about, oh, well, tidal forces could heat moons of outer planets, and these tidal forces could make liquid water, deepen the solar system. And so, I think that one of the exciting things to me that's happened in this whole field since then is this expansion of the notion of what a habitable zone is, and how there's other energy sources other than the star that can support life, and whether that could support anything sort of more advanced than, say, bacterial life is a question. The two things that come up in global change research all the time, I'm just going to run to the end because I'm running out of time, is this question of like how hard is it to destroy modern civilization. This shows up in the global change language or discussion a lot. There's a lot of people who think that global warming is an existential threat to modern civilization, and other people think, well, we're going to just muddle through and it's going to be a cost on the ecosystem, cost on society. It'll be existential for some people who lose their livelihood or lose their lives, but as a civilization, it's sort of a challenge, but not an existential threat. And I tend to be on that side of things. I think it's a little bit like the extinctions. I think it's tragic, unnecessary, but not an existential threat to some people and some communities, but not to humanity. Once we were in some meeting, and this question of how hard is it to kill off all life on Earth, I think that one's hard, unless you sort of melt the planet. Because you have the deep biosphere, you've got life all over the place. I think modern civilization, I think if you had a end Cretaceous type thing, you could maybe kill off modern civilization, but it's really hard to kill off life on Earth without melting the planet, I think. Okay, anyway, that's just babbling. Yeah, so, back again, just this question here, and I think the answer is that in most cases, organisms would be expected to destroy the conditions that allowed the organisms to succeed, but this is not a necessary outcome, and we're in a special position to affect the answer to this question. And that, Lovelock, I think, was wrong, but we can make him right. And that Lovelock had this idea that, there's all kinds of biological negative feedbacks in the system, and the biology is operating this system in a way that keeps the conditions good for life on this planet. And I think Lovelock was wrong. There is no teleology, there's no goal-directedness to how the planet functions until now. Because now because we have these brains that model ourselves as actors, and we think of counterfactuals and consequences of our actions, we have the ability to operate this planet in a goal-directed way. And being a risk-averse person, my goal-directed way of operating this planet is to interfere with natural systems as little as possible. So I think the more we pull back and interfere with natural systems, the more likely we are to persist. But people can disagree. There are some people who sort of want to terraform Earth and make it nicer. The main, I think our challenge is really to make Lovelock right, to operate this planet in a sort of teleological way. So, now coming back to some quotes, from Carl Sagan, that really our passion for learning is our tool for survival, right? So we learn about this planet, how it functions, and then, we can start operating it a little more cleverly. one thing, our department hopefully is going to hire some new people, and one of the things I've been arguing is exactly where we should hire is this quote from Carl Sagan, in that, over the last century, we've worried about lead in gasoline. We've worried about chlorofluorocarbons destroying the ozone layer, around CO2 in our fuels altering climate, pesticides, so on. And, that I say, okay, when we solve the climate, this is not the last things. That if we solve the climate problem, we made it so pesticides didn't kill off all the insects, got rid of the last of the CFCs and so on, that, something else is going to bite us down the road. And who's thinking about this? Who's thinking about what comes after the climate problem? What's the next barrier that civilization is going to run into? And, it seems like we need to be thinking about this now. And so I had the question like, okay, let's say it was 1918 instead of 2018. And you said, okay, what science could we have done in 1918 that would make the world a better place today? And I'm doing now energy system forecasting. Energy system forecasting in 1918 would have been a complete waste of time. You wouldn't have seen wind, solar, nuclear, whatever, automobiles. But, material science, coming up with new material, obviously health and education, but, coming up with new materials. If you would have come up with silicon, carbon nanofibers, all these things in 1918, that would have been great. But you also needed to couple that with life cycle analysis to say, okay, when we release these new materials into the environment, what's their long-term effect? And this environmental studies is something that if they had done in 1918 could have protected children from getting lead in their brains. It could have protected us from climate change. And so, that this, I think this anticipatory science of saying, look, what kind of materials can we produce, and then what happens when those materials are released into the environment? I think this is critical. So the other thing that Carl Sagan pointed out is that, democracy depends on an educated population. We obviously don't have an educated population, right? That I've had people email me telling me that I'm a technologist and it's how bad I am for believing in technology. And I'm saying, look, you're using a computer to tell me that technology is bad. That people have to understand, that technology, I don't know, but people assume a cell phone just works, and that's not technology, and that technology is that scary thing, and that unless people understand something about science, we're not going to be able to deal with our problems properly. And so, we need a population that understands how the world works and can vote appropriately. And this is really, the centerpiece of my talk here is that, can we live on this planet a long time, and can we get past this, tendency of evolution to optimize the fitness just going one generation forward, and can we make Lovelock right? Can we operate this planet for the long term? And I'll read it. While our behavior is still significantly controlled by our genetic inheritance, we have through our brains a much richer opportunity to blaze new behavioral and cultural pathways on short time scales. And it's really this as as kind of a charge of what we really need to be doing with our science and with our lives. And Ariel had this quote, and so I'm not going to go through it again, but just looking at our planet as one of many planets in the universe, and realizing that we are on this ecosphere, the spaceship Earth, and we need to try to make it life as we like it, to persist on it as a goal. And just to remind you of this other quote, that extinction is the rule, survival is the exception. I think we're an exceptional species, but we need to work at it. So thank you very much.
See if this works. By design, Ken wanted to reserve 10 minutes or so for questions. So we have about 10 minutes for questions and interaction from the audience. So Ken, do you want to moderate that and call on people?
The other people, I think another thing that would be appropriate in addition to questions, if there are people who've interacted with Carl Sagan and have anecdotes they'd like to relate, I think that would be a fitting thing as well. And also, the people who want to leave can leave.
There's a question over there.
Yes?
You mentioned interfering with natural processes as little as possible as your tendency. But you've also said we have to learn how to run the planet. Do you find those two statements contradictory? And if not, how do you resolve them?
Repeat the question.
Yeah, the question is, I said two things that were kind of contradictory. One is that we have to learn how to run the planet, and the other thing is I think that my bias is towards interfering in natural systems as little as possible. And, I guess I don't see that as a contradiction in that my feeling is that, unless you really understand complex systems really well, that interference in them is likely to produce unanticipated consequences and is dangerous. And so that if the natural system in which we evolved is providing us a pretty good home, that maybe our risk-averse way to run that planet is to let that natural system go on. But, people have speculated. In fact, I did some work with Edward Teller, and he wasn't worried so much about global warming, about us going into the next ice age, and could we, if the next ice age was going, could we engineer our way out of that? And obviously, that this kind of interference is very dangerous. But I do think, one thing, let's say, as the sun heats up, and now we're not worried about the next decades, but say a billion years, right? That, we can do things to put particles either in L1 point between the Earth and the sun, or in orbit around the Earth, or in the stratosphere, and reflect additional sunlight away from the Earth and extend the lifespan of the biosphere. And so I think right now our best course is to minimize intervention in the system, but that eventually that it might be in people's interest to take some active control. But I think right now, keeping the hands off the rudder, and right now, unfortunately, we're intervening in the system without understanding, or with understanding and without caring. And I think we have to stop doing that. David?
Yeah. A comment on something you said, and then a quick Sagan anecdote. The comment is that I think I see where you were going with this trophic levels of consciousness, and it's interesting because, and it does relate to this problem that genetics sort of inherently can only equip us to act on a certain time scale that is not the time scale we need to act on. Because, yes, due to the kinds of evolutionary forces you described, individual organisms developed the capacity to make mental models and act in a certain way that was anticipatory. And in a sense now, because we, as a global organism, if you will, or the thinking part of a global organism, are dealing with threats on that global scale and on that temporal scale, we need to develop that same capacity to have those mental models of those threats and act in an anticipatory way. Well, we have mental models in a sense. We have climate models, we have economic models, and so forth. So, but it's clear that genetic evolution is not going to give us that capacity. We have to create it through culture, through technology, through these other capacities we're developing. And depending on if you're an optimist or a pessimist or something in between, as I think you and I both are, you can argue that we are in the process of creating those systems which will give us that sort of global scale cognitive capability to act in that way that you're describing. The Sagan comment is on your question of whether it was just a myth that he would write his books in fully formed paragraphs. I saw him do it, walking on the beach, talking in his little, cassette micro recorder, writing Cosmos. And that's what he did. He didn't write it, he spoke it in complete paragraphs, and then had them typed out and made minor edits. So the myth is true.
Yeah, this thing about this is sort of back to economics a little bit, that economists, we evolve as local optimizers, and but we are heavily culturally influenced, and actually the Camus, who he was reading, he had this thing about imagine Sisyphus is happy, pushing that stone up the hill, and that you wonder, like, people built the Notre Dame Cathedral as a multi-generational thing that was aspirational towards some idea of permanence, and that one way of thinking about it is, these are sort of serfs working on this thing and just because they need to get money for food. But another way of thinking about it is, well, this gave people meaning to lug these stones and build Notre Dame, and that it seems to me that we can get collective meaning out of a project that would be positive for all of humanity. And I think that in a way this sort of economics and even evolutionary theory emphasizing self-interest and narrow personal gain, that I don't think, I think a lot of us are motivated by approval of our peers, by wanting a feeling of meaning in our lives and so on, and that not everything we do is narrowly self-interested in it. And I think maybe if in our culture we tried to emphasize more doing things for the public good, that maybe more people would start doing that. Oh wait, let's see. Let me just do one, two, three there, and then I don't know, maybe I don't know how much time we have, but okay, go on.
Given the timescale habitability of the planet and the propensity for successful organisms to change the conditions that they need for life, how many successful organisms or intelligent or conscious organisms should we expect from a planet like ours? It's not us. How many more chances are there?
I think intelligence is pretty easy to evolve. I read this nice book, I think it was by van der Waal, or maybe it was somebody else, but it was like, are we intelligent enough to know how smart animals are, or something like this. And the main thing is that brains have a cost, right? That they require a lot of energy, it's resources that won't be used for anything else. And so the hypothesis of this book was basically, we have the brains that maximize our fitness. And if you look at, an interesting case is to look at octopus, because most other intelligent organisms are vertebrates, and we have come from a sort of the same line of brain function, our brain architectures are the same, so octopus are interesting to look at because they're invertebrates. And they have actually distributed brain, so they can kind of tell their one of their arms to explore over there, and the actual detailed exploration will be done the intelligence of that will be done in the arm rather than in central processing. But octopus only live a year or two. They're carnivores, they invade disturbed places, and so they need to go in and have that dexterity to figure out how to adapt to a new situation, and having intelligence and how to get prey where they need to think about what ifs with the prey. And so I think the fact that on this planet right now some forms of intelligence develop both in vertebrates and invertebrates, and that's just at this time now. And the thing is, why aren't octopus more intelligent? Because it wouldn't improve their fitness to be more intelligent. So I just think, I think it tends to be carnivores and social animals. And so I think social carnivores are the intelligent animals because they need to coordinate with other beings, and they need to, go after motile organisms. So I think anytime you have high trophic levels in social organization, you're likely to get consciousness. So there was one over here.
But unfortunately, we're
okay,
on time.
Can I just do real quick ones, just because I told those two people.
Is there another session coming in here? Is somebody waiting to use the room?
Let's just do, I'll do
Go
30
for it.
seconds.
Go for it then.
I don't think we have time to go into that. So I'm happy to talk to you afterwards, but I don't really have concrete ideas on what to do there, unfortunately. It's said to be broadly educated and creative, but what?
My other question was, you talk about the billion-year timescale for life on a planet. What's the main variable that seems to
Oh, this
reduction, ability to reduce iron?
sun. It's
What's the main limiting factor?
stellar evolution. The sun's getting hotter, and eventually we'll lose our liquid water. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you all.